welcome to Your Intended Message. My guest today is Edward Segal. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Edward. 1, he's the best-selling author of the award-winning book, Crisis Ahead, 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Like that ever happens, right? And it's published in 2020 by Nicholas Brealey. The 2nd fact, he's a leadership strategy senior contributor for Forbes.com, where he covers crisis-related news, topics, and issues. And 3, he's the host of the new weekly podcast, The Crisis Management Minute, and each episode is a mini masterclass on crisis management and crisis communications. Edward Segal, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Hi, George. It's great to be with you today.
Wonderful talking to you, and I'm glad that we're not in a crisis right now, because we would be talking quite differently, I'm sure. Edward, what have you seen? Let's start with the bad, the wrong, the no-nos. What have you seen the mistakes that people make when their company, their organization is in a crisis?
Well, mistake number 1 is that they often do not have a crisis management plan. And a crisis management plan can act as a roadmap guidebook to how to respond, manage, and recover from a crisis. But even if a company has a plan in place, the chances are pretty good that they have not looked at it, reviewed it, or updated it in quite some time. And even worse, they haven't even practiced the plan against various scenarios to make sure it will work when needed.
And Ed, what I'm hearing there is, just like most buildings have a fire alarm, and they might actually have a drill once a year just so that people remember how to do it. But it sounds like when a company puts together a crisis plan, they think, well, we did that. We can check that off. It's done. We don't have to worry about that anymore.
Doesn't work that way. The comparison to a fire alarm is apt, because many fire alarms need a battery. It needs to be plugged in. It needs to be monitoring. And just because you have a fire alarm does not mean it's going to work when you have a fire or smoke or carbon monoxide poisoning. So just like a fire alarm, like you said, it has to be tested on a regular basis to make sure it will work, make sure it's updated, and metaphorically change the batteries as often as necessary to make sure the fire alarm will work when it's needed.
Edward, what should be in a good crisis plan?
First element is what's going to trigger the plan. What's the disaster, the emergency, the situation, the scandal of a company and organization, and what's going to trigger the plan? Who has the authority to trigger a plan? It compared to an umpire in a baseball game. Who's going to call the balls and strikes? Who's going to call the outs, and who's going to determine when the crisis plan has to be activated? But when the plan is activated, a lot of things should immediately fall into place in terms of assembling a crisis management team. And by the way, the team should be assembled before there's a crisis, not when you have the crisis. You need that plan. You need that team in place first. You need to determine the nature of the crisis, and then what I call the 5 W's and the H of any crisis: the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how of the crisis. Now, the reality is that many situations you won't be able to answer all those questions, but in any crisis, you need to get as much information as you can as soon as possible, fill in the blanks as needed, and update that information. And then you take the steps, you follow the plan, who's in charge, who's going to lead it, and what do you have to do to address the crisis, resolve it, and notify people about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're managing the crisis. I actually have a template for a crisis management plan. And if your listeners and viewers would like, I'd be more than happy to share that free template with them. You just fill in the blanks and update it, and take a look at the plan as soon as you get it. Fill in whatever you can immediately, and then when a crisis occurs, follow the plan and fill in the blanks the best you can.
And we can we'll have a link to that in the description below. Edward, is there a simple web address, or should we just put that in the?
Well, my web address is publicrelations.com. That's publicrelations.com, where you'll find information about the book. But if you send in or click on the link that you'll provide people, send me your email address, and I'll be glad to shoot that crisis management template to you right away. My email, by the way, is Edward Segal Communications with an S, Edward Segal Communications @gmail.com.
And that template sounds like a handy tool, because I can imagine a lot of people just thinking about a crisis plan get overwhelmed and don't know where to start, or are reluctant to start. And one of the challenges must be, which crisis do we prepare for? Because there are so many.
Well, that's the purpose of the plan. A plan, crisis management plan, helps you to prepare for every possible crisis, every possible contingency. There are some things you can plan for and say, well, we might have a problem such as bad weather, whether it's flooding, snow, hurricanes, tornadoes, depending upon where in the country you live. You should take steps immediately to prepare for those Mother Nature related crises. Other crisis situations, such as allegations of sexual harassment, fraud, counterfeit, all those kind of things, especially accounting or bookkeeping related issues. There are ways to take steps to mitigate, if not totally prevent, those kinds of crises. I've identified more than 100 different crisis triggers, and it's kind of like it's an extension of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. Well, my law is, if it's not a matter of if you're going to have a crisis, it's when, how bad it's going to be, how you're going to handle it, and how you're going to recover from it. And that's what the book and the crisis management plan template is designed to help people address those issues.
And one of the responses, of course, if the building's on fire, you call the fire department, they come in and they put it out for you, and then at some point, a leader needs to speak to, I'm guessing, the staff and perhaps the marketplace and customers. How does the leader prioritize who they talk to first, or does it vary?
It varies. For example, if you're the CEO of a publicly traded company, you'd want to address your investors and stockholders and investor analysts, the financial press that follows you. Of course, you need to keep your employees and consultants posted immediately. All of these people can actually be your brand ambassador, if you will, during the crisis. So they don't have to guess what you're saying or doing. You tell them, and they can help spread the word on your behalf. If you're a small company, you're not publicly traded, you've got, say, under 100 employees, you only have one store or a factory or an office, that's a different situation. You need to immediately reach out to your employees and your customers and staff and let them know what you're doing and why. No matter what kind of company or organization you are, you should take advantage of every possible communications tool and channel to get the word out. That means social media, of course, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, post information on your websites, direct messaging, emails, whatever it takes for you to communicate, not once, but on a continuous, updated basis. Let people know what the crisis is, let them know what you're doing, and let them know when it's resolved. And importantly, if it's a repeatable crisis, what steps are you taking to make sure it doesn't happen again?
And when we don't know what caused the crisis, there's a computer problem, or there's a financial problem. We don't know the details yet. We don't know who did what at what time. How do you handle that? What do you say? I don't know. I don't know.
Tell them, well, I wouldn't say you don't know. I said, we're investigating the matter. We're looking into the situation. We have members of our crisis management team are investigating the matter and seeing what the cause was. And we'll be sure to keep people updated at every step of the way. That's what a lot of companies do today anyway. If it's their technology, like Microsoft, they'll let people know there was a problem, but they'll also assure people the steps that they're taking, and let those who are affected by the crisis, let them know as soon as the crisis has been resolved, and importantly, what they're doing to help ensure the crisis is not repeated.
And Ed, I'm curious, is there certain language that one uses as you go through those separate stages? When, initially there's the shock, we recognize there's something wrong, we're investigating it, and then at some point we learn more, and then we actually fix it, and we're back, and maybe there's some restitution because customers were affected. Is there different language that one uses as you go through those stages?
You could use one language, plain, simple English. think like a third, fourth, or fifth grader. Make it as easy as possible for people to understand. You do not insult people's intelligence if you talk so they can understand them. You run the risk if you use jargon or gobbledygook, buzzwords, words or phrases that are unique to your industry or profession. They may have no idea what you're talking about, and you don't want to do that. You want it to be plain, simple language that anybody can understand. There are a lot of tools there that are available to make sure that you're not using gobbledygook. Read it to someone else. Ask for feedback. Just don't jot something down on your tablet or your computer and send it off as an email or other communications. Check the language, check the message, check the facts and figures that you're sharing with a trusted colleague or staff or consultants to make sure that there are no unintended impacts or effects of what you're trying to say. And very importantly, keep your attorney, your corporate attorney, in the loop. In some states, there may be laws or regulations that could very well affect your crisis. You don't want to say or do anything that, as you're explaining one crisis, you do something that creates another crisis.
If there's a possibility that the crisis the cause might have been something that we did wrong, we were irresponsible, or someone in our organization broke the law or rules of ethics, what kind of approach does the leader take and say, we got a criminal in here somewhere?
Well, first, you don't want to make accusations. No one's a criminal until they go through the legal system and the jury or a judge decides that they've broken a law. Don't make allegations. Don't make accusations. It's best to provide explanations and facts and figures about the status of the crisis. And depending upon the crisis and depending upon where the company is located, it may be very appropriate to apologize for the crisis, to say, I'm sorry for what happened. But it's a fine line between saying I'm sorry and taking blame or casting blame. And that's why it's really important to consult with an attorney before you make any statement or try to apologize in any way. In many states, there's something called the I'm sorry law, where you will not be prosecuted under their state law if you apologize or say you're sorry for a crisis. But again, I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on the internet. Check with your own attorney. Depending upon where you live, there may be laws or legislation that has a direct bearing on your crisis, and you don't want to create another crisis as you're explaining or apologizing for this one.
How does the leader or the spokesperson, how do they stay on fact and not get emotional when, in fact, it could be a very emotional crisis?
Practice, practice, practice. Before you have a crisis, a real crisis, test yourself against various crisis scenarios, crisis triggers. I have in my book, Crisis Ahead, dozens and dozens of crisis scenarios, and I ask people to take a little exercise. If X happened, what would you do? What would you say, and how would you handle it? And in terms of crisis communications, I urge members of your audience to do the same. If we had a B, or a C crisis, what would I say about it? And I provide advice in the book on exactly what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. But the more you practice before you have a crisis, the better job you're going to do when you actually have that crisis. Don't wait, don't wing it, don't wait until a crisis or a scandal or emergency to figure out what you're going to do or say. These practice sessions and scenarios can help you be prepared.
And I can imagine the importance of rehearsing. And would it make sense? What about when it comes time to talk to the media, to be interviewed? And should one rehearse for that as well? And should one have prepared statements and just go in there and see what they ask?
No, don't wing it, especially with the press. Everything you tell a reporter, a blogger, any member of the media, it's always going, you all should always assume it's being recorded. It'll be used and it's never off the record. So you have to practice your responses. But the more you think like a reporter, when you deal with a reporter, the better job you can do in dealing with the media. To go back to the 5 W's and the H, just like that's what reporters follow when they write their stories: the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. Answer those questions for the reporter in your statement, your information, and your answers. A lot of people do well with the initial statement to the press about a crisis, but they can often trip themselves up when they start answering questions. So part of the media training session that I do for my clients is not just to give them an opportunity to talk about the crisis in a mock session, but I also ask them very hard, very critical, very negative questions about the crisis. And often when they get in that situation with tough questions, that's when they get folded. That's when they get flustered. That's when they start to panic. But you don't want to do that in real time with a real reporter about a real crisis. So you need to practice, 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 whether it's talking to your investors, your staff, the media, the public. Don't wing it. Practice beforehand.
And Edward, I'm hearing there that practice, it needs to have someone in the room who's pushing them, who's asking those tough questions, even maybe kind of insulting them, just so that they can get used to staying in control.
Yeah, I've played the mean SOB reporter. Sometimes unintentionally, I bring people to tears. That's so tough on them. But I got to tell you, it's better that you have a panic attack in front of me in a private crisis messaging media training session between us, rather than going public and you have a meltdown on live TV or a Facebook session or a recorded session with a reporter. The tougher you can be on yourself, or the tougher a media trainer such as myself can be on you, that actually works to your benefit, because people come up with feeling more confident, more comfortable, and more ready to deal with what comes. It's great if they never get put in that hot spot and have a reporter ask the questions, but it's better if you're prepared, and then you can breathe a sigh of relief that it wasn't as bad as it could be. But if it gets really bad, then you could be rest assured that if you're prepared, it won't necessarily be as bad as it could be.
And a reporter's bound to ask questions that are emotional. How does one respond to emotional questions when one probably shouldn't show emotion?
It's important to show some emotions, like empathy, like concern, like sympathy. It depends on the crisis, but in most crisis situations, you're dealing with facts and figures, the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. The only place I think emotion should come into it is when you're expressing sympathy, remorse, regret, empathy, apologizing, but that depends on the situation. But just like delivering an opening statement about the crisis, practice your sympathy, practice your emotions, practice not breaking down and crying over something, but showing some interest, showing concern, showing how you're putting the interests and the concerns of the people who are affected by the crisis. In many crisis situations, depending upon the situation, company CEOs tend to put themselves in first, and you should always put the people who are affected by the crisis first. It's not about you. It might be your company, your organization, but it's someone else, a family, an individual, customers, clients, whoever that are affected by the crisis. Put yourself in their place. And if you were them, what would you want to hear you tell them?
Now, Ed, here's two phrases that I consider, um, I'll call them silly to be polite. I have stronger language. So here's two phrases I've heard that I think people should say, and it's, "Oh, I know how you feel." That just strikes me as
Well,
insincere.
many times it's impossible to know how someone else feels. You might say it's, well, I know how you must feel. I know how you could feel. I'm sorry how you're feeling, but don't put yourself. It depends on the crisis, of course, but there's a lot of things that's simply impossible. If someone died, if you're talking about the family member who died or was killed because of an accident, unless it's happened to you, you have no idea what they're going through. So you don't want to go overboard with the sympathy or the empathy. It has to be logical, it has to be consistent, and it has to be appropriate given the situation and what happened, who was involved, and how it affects them or others.
And I imagine we could easily point fingers and list companies who have mishandled at least part of the crisis process, and it might not be fair to point them out. Let's go the other way and point out organizations that handled crisis very well. Can you list one or two or three?
Well, I can certainly name the companies that have really screwed it up, and the companies that have handled it well. On the screwing up side of the ledger, I think Boeing aircraft company is right at the top of the list. Why? Because a few years ago, if you recall, two of their jet aircraft crashed overseas in different countries, a few weeks or months apart. When it came time to look at the situation, I won't name names, but some people jumped the gun and actually accused the pilots of causing the crisis. And it finally came out months later that the cause of the crisis was a software issue in the navigation and other software of the planes. And it certainly was not the pilot's fault. In fact, the company wound up being accused by others, including pilots, of not providing the right training for the aircraft, enough information about the software, and investigators later determined that was an important cause of those crises. On the good side, companies that have done a very good job of crisis communications, Microsoft. Lately, they have been immediately posting information and updates about patches that they found in their software that could be a problem in terms of hacking or ransomware, and not just talking about it, but when they announce the situation, they also announce that they fixed it or they will be fixing it. And that's a powerful 1-2 punch. Don't just tell people there's a crisis and you have a problem. Tell them what you've done or have done and how that problem has been affected. And don't wait. If you find out there's a problem or an issue at your company, the sooner you publicly disclose it, let everyone know, the better. Because if other people find out before you tell them, you could be accused of covering up or lying or being less than truthful. There have been a lot of companies over the last few years where they've had a hack of their system and millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of confidential information files of their clients have been stolen or compromised, and it didn't come out until months or years later that had happened. They didn't tell the world when they had that crisis. Others found about it later, and they've been penalized or prosecuted for their failure to immediately disclose. So when you're having a crisis, don't wait. Tell people right away.
Right away means within so many hours, so many days.
So many minutes. The sooner the better. because of the speed of social media and news organizations. As soon as they find out something, they don't wait, they post it right away. And if you wait until you see other people talking about your crisis and try to catch up, it's almost impossible to catch up and dispel or correct wrong information or facts or figures about the crisis. And that's a really important part of communicating or managing any crisis. Control the crisis. And part of the ability to control the crisis is that you're in charge. You're telling people immediately what the situation was, and you're helping to spin the story, control the narrative, and the message. But the longer you wait to get the word out, the worse it's going to look when the information about your crisis finally comes out, especially if it's being reported by others.
Edward, what I'm hearing there is that if soon as you know that there's a problem and you make that problem, that crisis public, it now appears you come across more truthful, more believable, as opposed to wait until somebody else finds it and they start accusing you, and now you seem to be a defendant and we're assuming you're guilty.
That's right. People and the media, they have a tendency to jump to all kinds of conclusions. Sometimes those conclusions are wrong, sometimes they're erroneous, and sometimes they're flat way out, having nothing to do with reality. Don't give people an opportunity to get it wrong. You have to control the message as best you can, and that goes back to you being the one to deliver the information. Another part of controlling the message is control yourself. Don't fall. You have to do what you can to resist the temptation to panic. You have to be calm, cool, and collected. You have to project authority and calmness, and that you're in charge, that you have a steady hand on the rudder, and just acting as if you were in charge, especially if you are, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you act in charge, the more you are in charge, the more you will be perceived as being in charge, and the more confidence you're going to give to others who are affected by it, by the reporters, by the public, by your investors, whoever your target audience is. You have to convey authority, calmness, and control at all times.
And Edward, what I'm hearing there is that when you are the one who is in charge, whether or not you have all the answers, or whether or not, even if you don't have a total confidence in the solution, you need to convey that you are in charge and you know where we're going. You can't let that doubt seep out of you, because they'll go, "Ooh, the leader looks nervous."
You don't want to show any nervousness or any doubt to what you're saying or how you're saying or what you're doing or how you're doing it. But that's another benefit of having a crisis management plan. You have that plan in place that gives you, or should give you, the comfort and the confidence that you know what you're doing. And then building upon that plan, you refer to the plan if necessary about how you're doing and what you're doing to the crisis. And that's another way to help provide comfort and confidence to the public that you're in charge, you're getting the job done. Because if you're not only do you risk making a crisis worse, but depending upon your company, you could actually lose market share. If you're publicly traded, your stock price might go down. Your customers might stop buying or patronizing you. Your employees might lose faith or confidence in your company. Their morale might suffer. It could be almost a death spiral that you cause because you're not confident. So you have to convey that confidence. And along the way, if anyone has any questions about what you're doing or why or the crisis, be open, answer all the questions. And if you don't know the answer, say, we're looking into it, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with the answer.
We're looking into it versus I don't know that answer, or the infamous no comment.
You never want to say no comment, because it implies that you're covering something up or you're being arrogant about it. It really depends on the crisis, though, about what you should be saying and how you should be saying it. A better version of I don't know is we're looking into it, or it's too early to tell, or the crisis just happened. We're gathering all the facts and figures about the situation, and we'll keep you posted as soon as we know something. There's a lot of good role models to look at in the news, especially, unfortunately, with all the mass shootings we've been having lately in our country. If you look at how the public officials, law enforcement officials, when they immediately communicate with the public about a mass shooting, for example, at a news conference, when reporters are asking all kinds of questions, the law enforcement officials will literally say, "We don't know yet. It's too early to tell. We're gathering the facts, the figures about the shooter or the situation," whatever it is. And that's something I always advise my clients, and I talk about in my book. If you study how well or poorly others in the news are managing or communicating about a crisis, it provides a great continuing education about crisis management and crisis communications. And when you look at these live or recorded news conferences by public officials talking about a crisis, put yourself in the shoes of the people who are speaking at the news conference. If you were in their shoes, what would you say? How would you say it? Do you think they're doing a good job? And how can you learn from their successes or mistakes?
Learn from others in the news. Edward, before we wrap up, if you had a chance to sit to, well, let's say you get a call from a CEO of a company who's got a crisis going on, and they said, "Edward, tell me what to do. What do I do now?" If there's 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice you would give that person, what might that be?
Don't talk until you know something. As soon as you know something, let people know what you know, and then update people as soon as you can with what you find out. The other thing I'd recommend is that they immediately activate their crisis management team if they have one. If they don't, then they should appoint it right away. But again, the more you're prepared for any crisis, if you have a crisis management plan, you have a crisis management team, you will be saving important, valuable time if you have these elements in place before there's a crisis. Otherwise, when that crisis breaks, you're spending a lot of time and an effort running around trying to put the plan together, trying to find out what happened, and trying to put a crisis management team in place. Don't wait until there's a crisis. Put all these things in place now, and if not when, or rather when, not if you have that crisis, you'll be better prepared for what happens no matter what.
My guest today is Edward Segal, reminding you, if there's only one thing you heard from today, and that's to have a crisis plan ready.